Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 24 of Music is Not a Genre. That is MxG. I mean, I've got the hands down now. I just need the speed. I finally have the hands down. I need the speed. If you're only listening to this, you're missing just a wonderful spectacle of hand dancing. Thank you, as always, for watching and or listening. Don't forget, you can support this podcast at patreon.com/music is not a genre. The public hub is youtube.com/@music is not a genre. My website is nickdimatteo.com. If you go to the contact page, you can sign up for the newsletter. Send it out a few times a month. So you get a lot of cool stuff there. And as always, please listen to and support my band REC at recarea.bandcamp.com. There'll be a little story about REC a little later on, actually, related to the content here. Let's get to the content. This week's episode is titled UK Hip Hop, The Brits Always Do It Better. So, right off the bat, I know that's controversial. Maybe not for everybody. And I don't know that it's completely true. But I think as a general statement, I would agree with that. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But first, let's talk about what we're talking about here today. And that is, as you know, if you've been following this podcast, a lot of what I used to do and still do from time to time is mine the treasure trove of CDs and other types of music that I have and base an episode off of that. So what I had here, and I've been planning this since last season, honestly, I wanted to do something on UK hip hop and UK music, not on the breadth of UK music, but the approach that UK music takes as opposed to US music, let's say. And I have these two artists here, which if you are watching, you can see, and if not, I will tell you. There are two CDs here, two albums from the artist Dizzee Rascal, and three albums from the artist The Streets. And I'm going to go over both of those artists, their careers, kind of an overview and their styles and everything like that, how I discovered them, etc., etc. And then I'm going to break out into a more general discussion of UK hip hop in general, the fact that this year, as of this recording, it's February 2023. This will be coming out in March. A few months from now, it'll be the ostensible 50th anniversary of hip hop, which we're going to talk a little bit about. And just then, in general, how UK music is produced and approached differently from US music. So it's kind of an overview, and then, of course, ending with the spotlight song. So let's get into Dizzee Rascal first. First artist to emerge of the two. Started in 2000. His name is Dylan Quebena Mills. And I discovered him in 2003, which was also the when his first album came out here, Boy in the Corner. This yellow album here I'm pointing to. If you're only listening, look it up. Boy in the Corner. Dizzee Rascal. Dizzee is two Z's and two E's, and Rascal is Rascal. And I discovered him that year because the British artists, Basement Jaxx, DJ artists who were one of my favorites at the time, put out an album, Kish Cash, which I don't know as much about that artist as I would like to. I haven't followed up with them that much. I've listened to some of their things, but I still say Kish Cash is just a monumental album and an amazing album and really representative of the kind of electro and techno and house and all that stuff, DJ music that was going on in the 2000s. Kish Cash with K's. Pick it up. It's worth listening to. Stream it, whatever you do. And there was a song on there called Lucky Star, which was one of their singles, I believe, and it featured Dizzee Rascal. And I loved his style, so I bought this album here, Boy in the Corner. So Dizzee's style is he uses dubstep. He is one of the pioneers of grime, which is a form of hip hop and just kind of general like electronic music in Britain. And he's fast. He's fast like you might hear on some of the Outkast albums of the time or even before then. And he's still around. He started in, like I said, 01. His first album was out in 03. And he has put out, singles and stuff recently. And his last album was 2020. And I'll go over the discography very quickly so you still have it. And he still has hits in his home country. I mean, there are plenty of other hip hop artists who have come since then who are bigger at now. But he was a critical darling and acclaimed. And, I did a little bit of research and listened through to his catalog for not all of it, but just kind of sampled it from past these two albums, which obviously I've heard all of before. And he's remarkably consistent. His style does very slightly, if I, had to describe it, there's elements of UK garage. Like I said, he's a pioneer of grime music. The bass line, which is just a heavy bottom. And then there's some R&B in there. But it really feels very kind of heavy electro. And yeah, you're going to hear a lot of dubstep in there as well. And the way he raps, the way his vocals are, like I said, very quick, and he's able to get intricate syllabic combinations to roll off the tongue. And yet, and this is interesting, and yes, I do have a bias in some ways toward Brits and British music, and that includes the accent, and he certainly has, a signature British accent. There's something about the way he is able to do what he does quickly and intricately, and you can still not just understand, because there are a lot of rap artists that you can understand, as quickly as they're doing, but you're getting the meaning of what he's saying for some reason. And I think that's part of his magic, is that he's able to really convey the, emotion and meaning through all that intricacy. All right. So the quick, overview of his discography. There is Boy in the Corner was an absolute smash when it came out. One of my favorite songs on there is Fix Up, Look Sharp. Is a pretty good representation of his early style, and the energy on that album was just nonstop. It was incessant. I think I listened to that album over and over and over, or this album if I point to it. And the follow-up here, Showtime, critically, apparently it was very acclaimed. Now, I remember getting it and thinking, okay, he's pulling back the energy a little bit, and, he still had some aggression there, but he's getting a little bit more contemplative. There's a certain way that it was produced that kind of stepped away maybe from the dubstep or even some of the drum and bass kind of stuff. And that wasn't where I was. So I liked it, didn't love it as much as Boy in the Corner, but according to the critics, it's amazing. And obviously I have it, so I did enjoy it. So I would recommend doing that. He then followed up with the album, that was 04, and 07 was Maths and English, 09, Tongue in Cheek, then a little break here, and then 2013, The Fifth, 2017, Rasket, Don't Gas Me was an EP in 2018, and then E3AF, which I'm sure stands for something, in 2020. And I listened to a few things, and some of the top singles that are streaming that came out in 2011 had that early energy. So, and then I listened again to stuff that from E3AF, and it's the same thing. There is just a remarkable consistency in what he does, and to me, so grime, just it's fast, aggressive, it's jagged, electronic. Kind of comes from like UK garage and jungle. It developed after grime kind of had its day into drill, which was really hardcore, electro more so. And then grime kind of had a resurgence a few years ago and blah, blah, blah. So now it's kind of all there in one way or another. And I think to me, I won't give you a generalized statement yet about what I think is specifically different about, the global like UK hip hop as opposed to US hip hop. But after I go through the streets and kind of describe that, you'll get a sense of where it is I'm coming from with this, because even though they have very different styles, there is a certain similarity, aesthetic similarity and approach that differs quite a bit from, U.S. hip hop. Not all. Again, these are general statements. There's a lot of U.S. hip hop. Like, I remember a band from about a decade ago, and they may still be around, called Death Grips, and talk about hardcore electro. I mean, they were there were some songs on the albums that I heard from Death Grips that were just hardcore insane and experimental in a lot of ways, and very unlike almost any other kind of US hip hop. And that's something to note as we get into the Streets and into some general statements. So the Streets, Mike Skinner is the guy's name. Started in 2001, even though he's actually a little bit older than Dizzee Rascal. I forgot how I discovered him. There's a really good chance I probably read about it and this album was acclaimed, or I might have looked up what other hip hop artists from Britain or whatever because of Dizzee Rascal. Or actually, I guess I got this before Dizzee Rascal, so that wouldn't be the case. Like I said, I don't remember. But he's still out there. He's performed under a couple of other names in the interim, but then came back to the Streets a few years ago and has, as recent as last year, released an EP. So again, very consistent, and good to see that both of these guys still have careers. That hiatus, which was from 2011 to 2017, was when he just wasn't doing anything under the name The Streets. He partnered up with some other people. He formed a band called the DOT, and then subsequently formed a band called Tonga Balloon Gang, and then came back to the Streets in 2017. So the first album, Original Pirate Material, in 2002, which is this one over here with the high rise, I guess the estates, maybe you might call them in Britain. I'm not sure if that's an estate, but I always like that. Amazing album. And before I even get to the rest of the discography, I have to make some comments about the style that the Streets has. And well, again, there is some UK garage in there. There is reggae and ska to a degree, but there's a lot of indie rock. And I think it may have been the first or one of the first hip hop artists anywhere to heavily incorporate indie rock into what they're doing. Obviously, hip hop has incorporated rock in its history. I mean, you can go as far back as Run DMC or the Beastie Boys, and so many things in between that have incorporated rock music. We know that, funk and R&B and reggae and ska and electronic music, all of that stuff and so much more has always been a huge part of hip hop. Soul, whether it's sampling or recreations or whatever it is, you don't get as much of rock and indie rock throughout its history, but it does pop up now and then, and it did here, with the Streets. There was a reviewer of The Guardian, and I'm sure I got this on Wikipedia because that's one of my main sources. Not the only one, but one of the main ones. A guy named Dave Simpson, who praised Skinner's The Streets' dazzling wordplay. And here's what's interesting about that. As far as I know, and I haven't heard everything, but I've heard quite a bit. And it seems like his rap style, it's like he is telling a story. There are pauses that happen between most of the lines that make you feel like he's just thinking it up on the spot, which I don't think is true. And that he's almost avoiding meter, avoiding any type of rhythmic repetition in his lyrics. And not that I love studying how hip hop's primary rhythms change. Like you could say at the beginning it was hip, 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 but to the hop, but it don't stop. Like it was very declamatory. You can say Sugar Hill or Curtis Blow, and then it goes to Run DMC, where it was a little more forceful. The lines were a little shorter, and they would da 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 da, like that kind of a rhythm. And then rhythms got much more loose and laconic in the late 80s, and even more so in the early 90s when you had like De La Soul and A Tribe Called Quest and people like that. And then you had some things happening in the early O's and in that were more the ends of the lines would change. As far as rhythmically, it wouldn't end where you think it would end and things like that. And then of course there's mumblecore rap, which has happened a lot lately, which to me is actually kind of brings it back around to what the Streets is doing. It's not that he mumbles his lyrics and is that kind of laid back about them. But the way he spits is very, it's again, seems like it's coming off the top of his head. And even though you can pick up the structure of the lyrics, they don't shout at you. And not that I don't like that. I love that too. But you can find where the alliteration, the rhymes are, and all the other, things that connect it and structurally make it more poetry than prose, lyrically, speaking. But it's almost like he avoids punching the point, is I guess a good way to say it. And his lyrics are often contemplative. There's a lot of story there. They're philosophical, and the music usually reflects that. If it's not indie rock, it could be. If you remember some of, when Dido's, partnered with Eminem, or however that worked out, like that kind of feel. There's a lot of that on what the Streets does or has done, at least the stuff that I've heard. So Original Pirate Material, again, Has It Come to This, is a good song to start with, because that kind of is that style that I was talking about, where it uses that kind of softer feel, but with some hint of haunting, nature in it. The next album here in the middle, A Grand Don't Come for Free, there's a song on there called Dry Your Eyes, which I really liked, but it's also just a very strong album. And then 2006, The Hardest Way to Make an Easy Living. There's a song on there, Memento Mori, which I just fell in love with when I got this album. It's a darker album, and that serves it well. I wish I knew why I did not get the next album in 2008, Everything Is Borrowed, but I plan to listen through to both these guys' catalogs, at some point, since I've done some of that already. I'm really kind of wet my whistle. Computers and Blues was 2011, and it was the last Streets album for quite a while, right? So then he switched over to the band The DOT, and released 2 albums, And That in 2012 and Diary in 2013. And then with Tonga Balloon Gang, he did a bunch of singles and EPs from 2015 through 17, and then reformed the Streets and released in 2020, None of Us Are Getting Out of This Life Alive, which is a perfect title for a guy who's that kind of philosophical and contemplative. And then a fun kind of political title for his 2022 single/EP, Brexit at Tiffany's. And very similar, like his voice has matured somewhat, and not to its detriment, but it's not quite as, kind of pointed and attitudey as it was in the beginning. But again, that consistency of kind of contemplation and all still is there. And so when you take these two as a whole, and you say, okay, Dizzee Rascal has more of that, hardcore electro approach, and the Streets has more of a, I would almost say, indie approach to a lot of what he does. Although there's certainly a lot of electro in there, and both of them have, kind of that funky hip hop, soul R&B to one or more extents. Dizzee more than the Streets. What you find, and this may just be because countries are different, people's interests are different, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's entirely true. I think there's a different aesthetic. And I'll say it this way. The music that is created in Britain, especially the music that is riffing on American music. So you can go back as far as the late 50s and 60s and British invasion and all that. You can even talk about Led Zeppelin with the blues, or Black Sabbath with harder music, and the second British invasion in the late 70s and early 80s, and how they took quite a bit from disco and techno and all of that stuff, and all the way on up through the ages. There have been British artists who have interpreted American music, and I just happen to like their spin. I think there's a certain, kind of onlooker, looking from the outside, where there's a freshness to the way they interpret whatever kind of music it is. But B, and I think this is even more important, is that they don't seem to be restricted as much by genre or the expectations of a certain genre. So, a good example would be, let's say, Dizzee Rascal, or even let's say The Streets, where if you listen to most hip hop from any specific era, a lot of what came out in any era sounds like you can pinpoint it, because it's, there were only certain sounds and styles of music that were considered acceptable or cool to use to create that hip hop music of whatever time that was. And yes, there's been experimentation throughout, and people have bucked the trend, and people have started new trends. You can talk about Timbaland and Missy Elliott in the 90s, who, kicked off some things that changed really what made, early 90s hip hop different from late 90s hip hop, or whatever it is. But I think on the whole, and this applies to pop music, this applies to quite a bit of, I think, rock music, and this applies to, techno, dance, whatever. There's more uniformity in production and arrangement in America than there is in the UK. And I defy any of you to come at me and say that that's not true. And if it's a bias, I own up to the bias. That's cool. But I want to be very clear in stating that I've listened to a lot of music from both sides of the ocean. And there are times where I've heard artists like Ellie Goulding, let's say. And at the time, a few years ago, there were a lot of songs and female singers who were doing, music like that, kind of like pop, electro pop, with a certain force to it, maybe you could say. And before I even knew who she was, there was something different about her sound that I said, ooh, I like this. This rises above a lot of what I'm hearing. And even though there are plenty of American artists I like of all kinds. And when I discovered she was British, I said, oh, of course. Because I can't tell you how many times I have listened to an artist not knowing they were British, but thinking, oh, that's a neat spin on the stuff that's already going on. And then, bam, it's a British artist where they're bringing in certain sounds and certain things that you would think, or that definitely in America would not belong in that genre, and they're putting them in there. And I find that to be, very much the case with UK hip hop. And it could be one of those things like, well, I live here, saturated with American music. So you hear something that's close to American, because let's face it, they're both English-speaking countries. And, that's not necessarily, talking about global music, or at least very far afield. But that is the part that makes it seem kind of interesting, because it's familiar in an unfamiliar way. The same, I think, has been said, or I've said about like certain Australian bands or Canadian bands, But Britain, I think, holds the standard as far as just like consistently good music. And from what I understand, and I'd like to find out firsthand, I've only been there once and it was a long time ago, they are real music fans. And they're not as, vocal and raucous. But what I've been told is it's because they're actually listening to the music, and they, just think of the Welsh and Scottish scenes and what's happened out of there, a lot of pop and power pop and things like that, and twee pop. I can go on and on and on. Like I said, it's an overview. I'm not going to get deeply into. I may do an episode one day that dives even deeper into the significant differences between very similar UK and US music, but that hopefully gives you kind of an overview of where I'm coming from with this. And I may refer to it again as we go on and on and on. In fact, let me give you some, again, like I said, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, the new wave, new romantics of the early 80s. Def Leppard, even to me, when you're talking about hair metal, even though there were a lot of successful hair metal bands in the 80s, there was always something a little, again, different about what Def Leppard did, lyrically even too. Or then you get into, Tricky in the 90s and trip hop. And then I think Mark Ronson and Calvin Harris are two of the best kind of like DJ-ish producers out there. And even though, it's funny, I was looking up artists to say, oh, well, US, UK. But then the two guys I went to were David Guetta and Martin Garrix, who are respectively French and Dutch. And yet, I'm going to say it, I don't find their production as interesting as I do Mark Ronson's or Calvin Harris's. So again, it sort of proves it in a sideways way. Ellie Goulding, like I mentioned. Dua Lipa, come on. You know how much music that's similar to Dua Lipa has been out there or has certainly come out since then. And I'm even talking about, people like Lizzo. Dua Lipa and Laura Mvula, much lesser known, but both British artists, and they have this, again, the sound they're creating is just, to me, more interesting than some very similar stuff that has happened here in the States. And I think partly it's because the people in the States who are of a certain level of success tend to gravitate to the same producers. And you can even talk about when I discussed in that one Podfast the Rina Sawayama album and the whole Clarence Clarity thing and who else she used as producers. But even as something as recent as, well, I don't know, just think of all the, was it Kelly Clarkson who just put something out, and then Demi Lovato put something out, and Pink put something out. Quality music all around. And the thing that I think rises above with all those are the vocals, like 1,000% the vocals. There are times to me when the production also rises above, and times when I feel like, oh, they're doing what other American artists are doing, and there's not necessarily anything significantly new there. And that, so what? You could say so what in that if it's a good song done well and the lyrics come across and the emotion and the performance comes across, who cares? But I'm a studio head. So I'm always listening for things that pique my interest, sonically. And when something comes in, that's what I try to do with all of rec music, is I try to throw in at least one element that you wouldn't expect to be there, but that still works. So that's the overriding point that I'm trying to make here. Let's give a tribute, first of all, to hip hop. That is, again, ostensibly 50 years old this year. Apparently August 11th, 1973, when DJ Kool Herc spun some records at a birthday party for his sister, I believe, in the Bronx. And yes, a lot of the birth and the development of hip-hop and early hip-hop especially happened in the Bronx, just a little north of here. And I think that in some ways you could say, yeah, I mean, how else can you say it? Because a scene started and led, I want to say 6 years later, to finally it being, put it on wax, as they say, was recorded for the first time and sold by record companies, etc. And I'll talk about that when we get there. It's as good a year as any to say it's the birth of hip hop, and that's wonderful. And the fact that something that to me and to many people has always seemed like a new-ish form of music is 50 years old kind of slaps you in the face and say, let's get over ourselves, But let's talk about a little bit about the history then. And again, this isn't an episode just on the history of hip hop, so it's somewhat of an overview, right? In the early, I have to. I was like, wait a minute, this isn't what I wanted to talk about. So, yeah, hip hop history. I kind of broke it down into phases. And after I do this, I'm going to jump back and talk about how UK took off of that and had their own sort of phases. There's the proto phase in the 1960s up through like 1973, where you had people from Jamaica and other islands, Latinx countries, primarily U.S. immigrants of color, doing certain kind of emceeing over instrumental music that was proto-rap. It's often been quoted that this comedic actor, singer, musician, Pigmeat Markham's 1968 single "Here Come the Judge" was the first recorded proto rap song. If you find an earlier one or a better representation, let me know. I've read that several times. I remember that song when I was a kid. I'm too young to remember it when it came out, but I remember my dad used to kind of sing the chorus of that every now and then. And then you have the early development, this is the pre-recording era from 73 to 79. Apparently, and that's, you're talking about people like Africa Bambaataa, DJ Kool Herc, and Grandmaster Flash, and all the people like that. Again, the Bronx. And this is all live parties and break beats and scratching, using disco and funk records, often even using some rock and other types of records, like that to kind of throw in whatever kind of fit, like real DJing, real crossfading and layering and stuff like that. But what I read is people usually say that the Sugar Hill Gang, whatever, the song was the first recorded song. Apparently, a little bit before that, there was this funk band, the Fatback Band, that released a song called King Tim the Third Personality Jock. And I listened to it. It sounds a lot like Sugar Hill Gang, but it came out a little before, which just to me says a lot of bands were doing the same thing at the time. And it was just kind of who beat who to the punch as far as putting out a recording. And that was in 1979. And then the first successes, finally it's on record, people are starting to listen. This is the first time I really became aware of hip hop, was from like 1979, 80, when you have Apache and songs like that, up through things like, Jam on It or whatever. Like that, to me, that era is like 80 to 85, fleshing out what rapping meant as a thing separate from where it came from, more electronic, like use of like Kraftwerk's type sounds and riffs and things like that, Planet Rock and all that, or minimalism when you talk about things like, they used to call drum machines beatboxes, which is where and then they would say, well, when a human does it, they're called a human beatbox, and that Fat Boys, if you know them, and then they just shortened it to beatbox, not meaning the drum machine, but meaning the act of doing, physical sounds, rhythmic sounds, at beatbox. So that came out a lot. You had minimalism like Run DMC, just rapping over a beat often, or a beat with a guitar and a bass, maybe a keyboard sound. And, even LL Cool J and all leading into that. You then get to the next phase, which is where they started to have more mainstream hits and bigger hits. That's the mid to late 80s. The Beastie Boys, of course. The hip hop became more overtly political when you had people like Public Enemy come in there and NWA. But then Fresh Prince, so there's a lot of pop. You had Lottie Dottie and Slick Rick. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later when I go over UK hip hop. But then you also had crossover like Walk This Way with Run DMC and Aerosmith. There were more movies. There had been movies, as early as I think 82. Wild Style and Breakin' and Beat Street and all that. But then you had Crush Groove. And, it was starting to influence fashion more. That's when sampling started to happen much, much, much more. And really the heavy sampling was like late 80s into the 90s before the courts caught up with it, essentially. And then it kind of blew up and went eclectic to say, well, we can continue to be, hardcore and declamatory, or we can pull back even more and get bands like De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Diggable Planets, even Young MC. Again, I'll talk about him later. And the production is really tight. It was drier. Same changes that happened in other kinds of music from the 80s to the 90s, where it dried out a lot of the reverb. And to me, I've always felt that, at least as far as my tastes go, and I've seen it written too, and your mileage may vary, that like, you want to go maybe to the late 80s, but through the from mid 90s is the golden age of hip hop. And then it kind of crosses over into more kind of boastful and blingy kind of, there was a realization that this could make a ton of money, and let's go for it. So after people like Tupac and Biggie, were out of the picture, it switched over to more kind of like, Ludacris and stuff like that. But then you also have Missy Elliott, who was pioneering at the time. And there were a lot more, even though women have been a part of hip hop since the 70s. And you can even talk at 80s, Roxanne Shante, and then late 80s and the 90s, and Queen Latifah and Salt and Pepper and all that stuff. You got Missy Elliott. And then from that point on, or Lil' Kim or whatever, the presence of women in hip hop never waned. It just kept growing and growing and growing through the mid 2000s. When you get to the late 2000s and early O's, that's when things just kind of blew up, because it happened in a lot of music where now you had the internet and free and easy ways to record music from your home. And so there was a lot more diversification of what was going on in the hip hop world, which is why you might get a band like the Death Grips, and or Chitty Bang or another band like that. And it was at a point where I think the early O's, there was some mid O's dominance in terms of the charts. I think was maybe the first time that hip hop was the biggest seller. And it apparently dipped slightly after that. But that was, I think, partly because of the internet, because every damn thing dipped. But also there was more indie, more experimentation. And then all of a sudden you get out of that, just this explosion of what starts to me out as like indie, like Kendrick Lamar and Drake and the ASAP gang and all of that in the mid-teens to late teens, that revolutionizes what's going on in hip hop. And again, with, people like Nicki Minaj and Cardi B and just all of the, female presence, it's become now, it's in, what's a good word for it? It's unavoidable. You no matter where you go, you're either going to hear a hip hop song, strictly speaking, meaning with rap, or a hip hop song, which hip hop as a style doesn't have to actually have any rap in it. It's a style itself. It's a style of art and fashion and music. And rap is just something, is also a type of music, but it's a specific subgenre, I think, of hip hop. And it's also what you do in a lot of hip hop songs. But you have this diversification of styles and sounds and deliveries from the mid-teens on that I think has never stopped. So let me then go back and say, well, all that was happening in the US. But shoot, hip hop's everywhere in the world now. And first I'm going to talk about UK, because that's partly what this is, and then I'll talk about a little bit more globally, what was going on or what is going on. So in the early 1980s, you had bands like Wham and Adam and the Ants doing raps within their songs. You had The Clash, who after their first album or two were just so freaking diverse in what they did. They included like reggae and ska and stuff, but also a lot of rap and I don't even want to say hip hop. I don't think they ever did hip hop, but they rapped in their songs. And then the manager, Sex Pistols, had a single in the early 80s, Malcolm McLaren, Buffalo Gals, which I think if you know this kind of music, everybody knows that, right? And then to me, there was a period when not a lot crossed over from Britain hip hop wise. I had to look this up, and there were apparently some stars in the 80s, Derek B and Rebel MC, right? But then towards the later 80s, mid-late 80s again, you had Slick Rick, Lottie Dottie. You had Young MC, Bust a Move. And those were to me, the first like true big time crossover, like pure hip hop successes. It is those people like that, so late 80s into the early 90s. Again, you have bands. I don't think there was a lot of crossover there as far as actual hip hop, like raps with rapping. And again, I'm kind of flubbing what I'm trying to say here, but I think you understand, or hopefully you'll understand the difference between hip hop as a style and rapping as a function of that style, right? So you had Hijack, Silver Bullet, Gunshot, The Brotherhood, Cookie Crew was an all-female band. And they apparently were popular in Britain in the early 90s. And there was also a lot of music influenced by hip hop, or could be called hip hop in style, but without any rapping, like Soul to Soul, which was a music collective with their hits Keep On Moving and Back to Life, which I can still hear in my head right now. They're incredible songs. And again, songs that caught my ear at that time that to me were similar to, but different in a good way, from American music of the same kind. You had the band Stereo MCs, who had been doing, hip hop, or live instrument hip hop, since the mid 80s. And they had a song called Connected, which was their big hit in the States anyway. Nena Cherry's Buffalo Stance, again, not a rap song, but you're crazy if you don't say that it's some kind of a hip hop song, or at least hip hop influenced. And then mid 90s, and again, kind of murky for me, because guess what? I don't live in that country, the UK. That's why I had to look this up. Artists called Roots Manuva, Mark B, Mr. Scruff, and the Herbalizer. I think a lot of those people, again, started in the 80s, like the ones I'm going to mention next, but then came to prominence in the 90s. Massive Attack with Tricky. And there's this Massive Attack song that's come back recently that just blows me away every time I hear it. Unfortunately, I didn't put the name down here. If any of you guys are listening or watching, comment. Tell me what it is. It's a haunting song. MF Doom. So then you had trip hop and garage influenced hip hop and all of that happening, that all of a sudden artists in the UK weren't just making, let's say a chart impact on hip hop. They were starting to make an actual cultural and artistic impact on hip hop across the world. Going into the early 2000s, all those people were still working, but then you had two big female rappers, Shiesty and MIA, which, I mean, everybody still, I think, knows who she is in the States. Kalashnikov, Akala, Low Key, Poisonous Poets. Grime was big then. In the later 2000s and early 2010s, you had, and then of course, don't let me forget Dizzee Rascal and The Streets in the early 2000s, and through the O's, really, they were pretty damn successful, and I think Dizzee even longer than that. But through the late 2000s and early 2010s, you had bands like N-Dubs. There was Tinchy Strider, Tiny Tempa, Chipmunk, later known as Chip. Again, I don't know these artists, but I want to at least throw them out in case somebody's interested in exploring UK hip hop through the ages. That was post-grime. That was UK drill. That was that era, And another artist named Plan B, who was a hip hop DJ, and all of that. When I was forming REC, I told you I'd get to this. Back in the early O's, we made a list of names that was maybe 20 something long. Before knowing, you cross-referencing, does somebody have that name? And one of my favorite names was Plan B, because I had a career as a solo artist. And then I'm like, I don't like what's happening here. I need to switch it up. I need to form a band and do some different sounds and etc. So it was a Plan B. So I thought, that's a perfect name for a band. Looked it up. Somebody already had it. That's who that is. A British guy. I'm like, of course it's a British guy. It's no accident that I named my first REC album Parts and Labor, spelling labor Labour, because I wanted to, as I said in other podcasts, make an homage to the UK and the influence of the UK on my music. Then in the mid 2010s, you had Koji Radical, Slow Tie, Lil Sims, who people still know here, Loyal Carner, Jess, Task Force, King Cashmere, Miss Diggy, Skinny Man, and a guy named Dave, who's apparently one of the biggest hip hop artists in the UK to this day. And I think that's just freaking awesome that his, artist name is Dave. My brother's name too. Late 2010s through today, you have Stormzy Skepta, who's apparently huge. Bugsy Malone, Dave again, Central C, Russ Millions, H. Because the British, that letter, they say H. But if you spell the way the English say it, the Americans say it, it's Aitchh. That is that artist's name. Tion Wayne, Lady LeSure, and Miss Banks, two big female artists that were coming to prominence around the same time as people like Nicki Minaj, Cardi B, Megan Thee Stallion, in the U.S. gaining fame, just, the prominence of female artists. And to me, I won't say that. I think that male and female artists in hip hop are doing equally interesting things all over the place. But the diversity of what's going on in terms of recognition, at least in the female hip hop world, because I think it's always been there artistically, has really increased in the last 10, 15 years. And so that's kind of an overview of UK hip hop. Now, as you may know, I'm talking about US, I'm talking about UK. Hip hop is virtually everywhere in the world, one degree or another. Either people listening to it is probably almost everywhere, unless there's restrictions in certain countries or the technology is not there. But out of the around, your count may differ, 195 countries in the world, official countries in the world, 92 of them have hip hop scenes. So almost 50% of all the countries in the world have not just, somebody recorded something, but actual hip hop scenes, hip hop styles. Man, if I had more time, I'd read you the list or go through some of my favorite countries with hip hop. I remember when I was producing that Hungarian song a couple of years ago and looking up Hungarian pop to see what kind of music was being produced there. It blew me away that pretty much all kinds, just like in the States, in the UK, in other countries, including hip hop. And so that was kind of awesome. Now, contrast with this, 50 years of hip hop, 92 countries. Rock music has been around, let's say 70 years officially. That's 20 years longer. Rock, according to some sources, Wikipedia and a couple others, is in 102 countries out of 195. So recording-wise, 10 more than hip-hop, but 20 years longer. You can see how quickly hip-hop is catching up to rock. And I think something to illustrate is that the distance between the birth of rock and roll, which is somewhere between 1948 and the mid-50s, and the birth of hip-hop, which again, somewhere between 1968 and the mid-70s, so a 20-year gap, 20 years, is much smaller than the distance between the birth of hip-hop and today, which just shows you, how long hip-hop has been around. It's like if a 70-year-old person marries a 50-year-old person. Nobody's going to blink. All right, there's a decent age difference, but they're both, been around a while, they're grown, they know what they're doing. As opposed to if 40-year-old person marries a 20-year-old person. That can be done, but the age difference is more stark. So the longer these styles of music are around, the older they grow, the less significant that change seems, to the point where you may even say that the development of hip hop was just one of the natural offshoots of rock and roll and the other styles that it came from. Because it really starts to converge, because it's further back in history. Compare both of those with electronic music, which has been around in some form since the 40s, at least, and in recorded form as far as releasing singles and stuff since, I would say, the 60s. There might have been some in the 50s. There's only apparently 61 countries that have a significant electronic music scene. So that just shows you again the popularity of hip hop, and blah, blah, blah. I've got a bunch of notes here. I don't need to, go over that, but it does bring up something that I'm going to do in a future episode. I think it's going to be a pod fast, because there's just not quite enough material for a full episode, and I want to do a pod fast anyway. And that is that I make the case that in all of the world, there are actually only 8 genres of music. Contrasting with a list I saw online that, had 1,400 genres of music, which didn't include a couple I specifically looked up, which to me put those two numbers together, compare, contrast, and with my comment about it, that even the long list not having certain genres on there. And I'm going to help you understand in that podfast exactly why music is not a genre. Exactly why, whether you say there are 8 genres or 100 or 1,400 or 2,000, so what? You know, too much crossover, too much bleed through. Good music is good music. Music is music. So that, I think, is my final statement that I'm going to say about this general topic this week, which leads to, of course, the Spotlight song. I've discussed here and there that I've been involved with hip hop as a creator since the early 80s. I used to write raps back then that I maybe, showed to my brother, performed for my brother or parents or something, but never did much else with. And would do covers of like Run DMC and Beastie Boys songs at DJ sets where we had the instrumental versions, and my friends and I would do that. The first hip hop song that I wrote and recorded was released over 30 years ago now. And then I took quite a break from it for whatever reasons, and I won't go into them at the moment. I'm sure I'll do another episode on hip hop in some form, and I might do it then. But then after the first Rec album, I was commissioned to do some music for a film company and did a theme song for the first movie, which was also kind of a series that was like a 6-part series that was put together to make a movie called This End Up, a comedic series about a moving company. And I wrote and recorded the theme to that. And that is now on the new album, It Wasn't Me. It's one of the highlight tracks on that album. It's called This End Up. And so the lyrics riff on the movie subject of a moving company. The lyrics are comedic. I go for making the subject of moving boxes and helping people move into their homes into this serious, like we can kick it out thing. And the reason I chose this song is a couple of reasons. One is I don't have that many hip hop songs in my catalog, and I've already highlighted some of those, so I don't want to repeat unless I have to. And I got a large catalog of recorded music, so that I didn't want to do. I haven't highlighted this song, but also if you listen to the style, and it's coming up in a minute or so please stay tuned or look it up on streaming. It's everywhere now, is not strictly what was going on in hip hop in the US at that time. I use some global influences. You'll hear I use some indie influences, indie rock and stuff like that, and then certainly some hip hop and techno influences. And that's how I like to produce in general. That's the kind of music that interests me. And I had just a ton of fun with it. And I think that you'll hear that in the song coming up in 30 seconds, probably. Are you a hip hop fan at all? If you've gone this far in this podcast, I hope you are. Did you know Dizzee Rascal and the Streets? Have you heard of them? Are you aware at all of any UK hip hop? It's, other than people like Dua Lipa and, the huge people that come out from the UK like that, Adele. I know there are a lot of crossover, but we may not know a lot of what's going on here. I'd like to know if you do, though. Let's talk about it. Are you into any hip hop not from the US or the UK? One of my kids speaks French, loves French music, has listened to some French hip hop. I find some of that interesting. Like I said, some Hungarian. I don't know a lot about anything really anywhere else, but I'd like to know if you do. And where do you think hip hop belongs in the overall history of music? This is not an argument we should even be having anymore, but it is a discussion we should be having, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for joining me this week. I've got an announcement coming up in a couple of weeks. That's pretty big. And until then, stick around, listen to the song, and I will talk to you next week.
Murphy. This is the one. 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 Trust with your precious things, crystal lamp, a kitty swing, a sofa bed. Don't sweat your head, don't stretch your bread, call us instead.
Our guarantee is what you need, and we've been moving you with speed, a legacy of dignity, cause we about the family, community, integrity from C to C. We gotta be the number one company, McMurphy.
We got the firm grip, life is a trip, and we never slip. When you want it now, get the whole power. We're gonna make you proud. Big man come and invade your home, bust up your stuff, scuff up your gnome, and leave you broken and going home. Is lying up, what the fuck all wrong?
Treat each box like a pussy cat, all soft and careful, yeah, like that. Move them in and out and in. Then we go back to the mic and do it all again.
Do it all again. Back to the Mac
truck.
From the left coast to the right coast, we don't stop.
You're stuck in, we're trucking, you're staying, we're praying. You're needing, we're speeding, you're moving, we're grooving. You're stuck in, we're trucking, you're staying, we're praying. You're needing, we're speeding, you're moving, we're grooving. You're stuck in, we're trucking, you're staying, we're praying. You're needing, we're speeding, you're moving, you're moving.
We got the firm grip, life is a trip, and we'll never slip. When you want it now, get the whole power. We're gonna make you proud. We got the firm grip, life is a trip, and we'll never slip. When you want it now, get the whole power. We're gonna make you proud.